The massive fraud scandal in Minnesota that captured the media's attention has spurred action across the Trump administration. Of course, that was the underlying fraud that brought the Homeland Security up there that's created what we see all this conflict.
At 10:23 a.m. downtown Minneapolis, FBI Director of Financial Crimes Division, Agent Rebecca Thornton, stood before a wall of seized evidence and delivered a statement that would send shockwaves through the heartland. Over the past 18 months, a joint task force involving the FBI, ICE, DEA, IRS Criminal Investigation, and Department of Homeland Security has dismantled a $19 billion fraud network that funneled taxpayer money directly into the hands of the Sinaloa cartel. At the center of this operation sits Minnesota State Senator Daycare Yusuf Hassan, a once celebrated refugee success story who rose through Minnesota politics to become one of the most trusted voices on immigration policy and social services reform. But behind the press conferences and the legislative sessions, Hassan had built something else entirely. A continental money laundering empire that turned Minnesota into a cartel fortress, a drug empire hub, and a transnational criminal headquarters disguised as a progressive social safety net. This is not a story about poverty or desperation. This is a story about engineered betrayal, political collusion at the highest levels, and a criminal network so deeply embedded in government systems that it operated with complete immunity for over 9 years. And if you think corruption has limits, you are about to see how deeply wrong you are. The operation began at 4:32 a.m. on November 8 in the Cedar Riverside neighborhood of Minneapolis, a densely populated area known locally as Little Mogadishu. The streets were silent under a heavy blanket of fog. Neon signs from late-night convenience stores flickered in the cold darkness. Frost-covered parked cars along cracked sidewalks. Then the silence exploded. FBI tactical units, ICE enforcement teams, Minneapolis SWAT, DEA agents, and DHS investigators descended on 23 locations simultaneously across Minneapolis and St. Paul. Flashbangs lit up the pre-dawn fog like lightning. Battering rams smashed through reinforced doors. Agents in black tactical gear poured into buildings with surgical precision, their movements fast and coordinated. The first target was a 3-story building on Riverside Avenue with a faded sign reading New Horizon Community Services, a nonprofit that claimed to provide job training and financial literacy programs for refugees and immigrants. Inside, agents found something entirely different. Rows of desks staffed with clerks processing fake invoices for child care programs that did not exist. Computers running automated scripts that filed fraudulent tax returns and Medicaid claims by the thousands. Encrypted servers coordinating wire transfers to shell companies in Dubai, Nairobi, Mexico City, and Istanbul. And in a back office behind a locked steel door, agents discovered duffel bags stacked floor to ceiling. Inside those bags was $6.4 million in cash, bundled in vacuum-sealed plastic, labeled with dates and route codes. On the same desk sat a laminated ledger with columns listing cocaine shipments, fentanyl pill deliveries, methamphetamine distribution routes, and cartel payment schedules. This was not a community center. This was a cartel finance hub. Within 2 hours, federal teams hit 22 more locations. A halal grocery store in South Minneapolis that served as a cash collection point for narcotic sales. A logistics company in St. Paul that coordinated human trafficking and migrant smuggling routes from the southern border to the upper Midwest. A real estate office in Bloomington that purchased properties with drug money and leased them back to the state as subsidized housing. A medical clinic in Rochester that billed Medicaid for services never provided and funneled the reimbursements into offshore cartel accounts. At every site, agents found the same infrastructure: fake nonprofits, falsified documents, encrypted financial networks, and direct ties to the Sinaloa cartel. By sunrise, federal agents had seized over $47 million in cash, 14 tons of methamphetamine, 890,000 fentanyl pills, 340 kilograms of cocaine, 19 high-capacity firearms, 127 encrypted laptops, and 91 server racks containing financial records that would take months to fully analyze. But the biggest discovery came from a locked safe inside New Horizon Community Services. Inside that safe, agents found a single encrypted hard drive. And on that drive was a digital signature that appeared on every fraudulent transaction, every cartel payment authorization, every wire transfer to Mexico. The signature belonged to Minnesota State Senator Daycare Yusuf Hassan. At 11:58 a.m., inside the FBI Cyber Forensics Lab in the Federal Building on South 4th Street, analysts cracked the encryption on Hassan's hard drive. What appeared on their screens was not just a criminal network. It was a parallel government. The operation had a code name: Project Golden Corridor. The network diagram stretched across 6 monitors, showing a web of over 340 shell companies, fake nonprofit foundations, sham daycare agencies, fraudulent medical billing firms, ghost logistics contractors, and offshore financial accounts that moved money through Turkey, Kenya, the United Arab Emirates, Mexico, and the Cayman Islands. At the center of it all sat Senator Hassan. His encrypted authorization key was embedded in every major transaction. Beneath him were coordinators embedded in Minnesota's Department of Human Services, fraudulent daycare operators who claimed millions in state subsidies for children who did not exist, billing specialists who filed tens of thousands of fake Medicaid and food assistance claims, and cartel liaisons who converted the stolen taxpayer money into cocaine, fentanyl, methamphetamine, and heroin purchased directly from Sinaloa cartel suppliers in Mexico. The money flowed in a perfect loop. Fake nonprofits applied for state and federal grants to provide services to refugee and immigrant communities. Those grants were approved by officials Hassan had placed in key administrative positions. The nonprofits then submitted invoices for services that were never delivered, patients who were never treated, children who were never enrolled, and job training programs that never existed. The state paid the invoices. The money was wired to shell companies and offshore accounts. A portion was kicked back to Hassan and his network through consulting fees, campaign contributions, and real estate transactions. The rest was transferred to the Sinaloa cartel in exchange for narcotics, which were then distributed across Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, North Dakota, and South Dakota using migrant smuggling routes and human trafficking corridors that Hassan's network controlled. Investigators found contracts with cartel operatives in Culiacan and Tijuana, pricing sheets for methamphetamine, cocaine, heroin, and fentanyl pills, coordination logs for drug convoys moving north from the southern border under the cover of legitimate freight and agricultural shipments, and payment records showing that Hassan's network had funneled over $19 billion in fraudulent claims and stolen taxpayer money over the course of 9 years. This was not corruption. This was command-level collusion with one of the most dangerous drug cartels on the planet. One senior FBI analyst, a woman named Dr. Elaine Kruger, stared at the screen and said what everyone in that room was thinking. He didn't infiltrate the system. He became the system. At 5:14 a.m. the following morning, inside a federal command center at Minneapolis-St. Paul International Airport, a digital map of the upper Midwest glowed across a massive screen. Red markers pulsed across Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, the Dakotas, and Nebraska. 87 locations, all connected to Hassan's network, all operational, all moving money and narcotics in real time. Standing in front of that map was Assistant Director Martin Cross of IC, flanked by FBI regional commanders, DEA division chiefs, IRS criminal investigation supervisors, and Homeland Security tactical coordinators. This is the largest coordinated financial fraud and cartel eradication operation in the history of the upper Midwest, Cross said, his voice steady and cold. Over 1,200 federal agents, 74 SWAT teams, air support from U.S. Customs and Border Protection helicopters, Black Hawk units, ground coordination with state police across 5 states, and tactical support from the U.S. Marshal Service. The mission was named Operation Iron Ledger. At exactly 6 a.m., the raids began. In Edina, a wealthy suburb south of Minneapolis, agents stormed a luxury office building owned by a consulting firm that claimed to specialize in immigrant integration services. Inside, they found no clients, no staff, just rows of computers automatically filing fraudulent tax returns and Medicaid claims around the clock. Agents seized $12 million in cash and 34 encrypted devices. In St. Cloud, federal teams hit a warehouse registered as a food distribution nonprofit. Inside, they found no food. They found 2.1 million fentanyl pills packaged for street distribution, 480 kilograms of methamphetamine, and shipping manifests coordinating deliveries to cartel distributors across the Midwest. In Duluth, near the Canadian border, ICE agents raided a trucking company that claimed to haul agricultural products. Inside the trucks, they found hidden compartments loaded with cocaine and heroin, false bottom cargo containers designed to evade inspection, and GPS logs showing repeated crossings near unmonitored border points. In Rochester, agents hit a medical billing company that had submitted over $340 million in fraudulent Medicaid claims over 6 years. They found automated claim generators, fake patient records, falsified medical histories, and direct wire transfers to cartel accounts in Mexico. In Mankato, agents stormed a real estate investment firm that had purchased 68 properties across southern Minnesota using drug money. The properties were leased back to the state as subsidized housing and emergency shelters, generating millions more in fraudulent rent payments. Across the region, federal teams seized over $89 million in cash, 6.7 tons of methamphetamine, 3.2 million fentanyl pills, 1,100 kilograms of cocaine, 340 kilograms of heroin, 87 vehicles, 43 properties, and enough financial records to prosecute over 200 individuals. They arrested 94 people, including nonprofit directors, medical billing specialists, logistics coordinators, daycare operators, and direct cartel operatives. The underworld took more damage in 9 hours than it had in the last 9 years. But investigators were about to discover something that would shake Minnesota politics to its core. At 3:47 p.m., inside a secure investigation room at FBI headquarters, forensic accountants were examining the seized financial logs and internal emails recovered from Hassan's network. What they found was a web of corruption that reached deep into Minnesota's own law enforcement, courts, and state government. 22 caseworkers at the Minnesota Department of Human Services had taken payments ranging from $8,000 to $120,000 each to approve fraudulent daycare licenses, fast-track subsidy applications, and delete fraud investigation requests from the system. 11 auditors at the Minnesota Department of Revenue had been paid to ignore red flags, approve suspicious tax refunds, and delay enforcement actions against shell companies. 6 county judges had received cash payments and campaign contributions to dismiss fraud cases, seal court records, and reduce sentences for operatives arrested on drug charges. 4 state legislators, in addition to Hassan, had taken money to block oversight bills, cut funding for fraud investigation units, and pushed through legislation that made it easier for nonprofits to receive grants with minimal accountability. And 9 police officers across Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Bloomington have been paid monthly stipends to tip off Hassan's network about upcoming raids, ignore drug distribution activity in certain neighborhoods, and falsify incident reports. Internal communications showed that Hassan had personally coordinated the placement of loyalists in key administrative positions across state agencies. He had influenced hiring decisions, blocked internal investigations, and ensured that whistleblowers were reassigned or forced out. One veteran fraud investigator at the Minnesota Department of Human Services, a man named Richard Gunderson, told federal agents that he had flagged Hassan's network 3 years earlier. "I submitted a 47-page report documenting the fraud patterns," Gunderson said, his voice filled with frustration. "I showed the fake invoices, the ghost daycares, the shell companies. My supervisor told me the case was closed due to lack of evidence. 2 weeks later, I was reassigned to a different division. Now I know why. They were protecting him from the inside." Federal investigators realized they were not just dismantling a criminal enterprise. They were dismantling a parallel enforcement system, a shadow government that had been built inside Minnesota's legitimate institutions to shield the Sinaloa cartel from exposure. And every badge, every office, every oath that had been corrupted would have to be rebuilt from the ground up. But the scale of Project Golden Corridor did not stop at Minnesota's borders. At 8:21 a.m. the next day, federal investigators expanded their operational map to include the entire continental United States. What they uncovered was a nationwide pipeline. Hassan's network had established cartel logistics hubs in 14 states. Money stolen through fraudulent claims in Minnesota was wired to shell companies in Texas, Arizona, California, Michigan, Ohio, and Florida. Those companies then purchased narcotics directly from Sinaloa cartel suppliers in Mexico. The drugs were transported north using a sophisticated network of long-haul trucking companies, agricultural freight routes, and migrant smuggling corridors that Hassan's operatives controlled. The routes passed through El Paso, Laredo, Tucson, and San Diego, where shipments were handed off to distributors who moved them into the heartland. Investigators found that Hassan's network could move up to 4 tons of methamphetamine and 800,000 fentanyl pills per week without triggering federal alerts. Shipping manifests were falsified to label drug loads as farm equipment, textiles, or construction materials. Way stations along key routes were bypassed using pre-approved trucking credentials that Hassan's network had obtained through bribed transportation officials. And human trafficking convoys were used as cover for drug shipments, with migrants unknowingly transported alongside hidden narcotics in false-bottom cargo vans. Federal agents working with Mexican authorities identified cartel coordination centers in Culiacan, Tijuana, and Ciudad Juarez, all linked to Hassan's financial network. The Sinaloa cartel had recognized Minnesota as one of the most secure and profitable distribution hubs in the United States, a cartel fortress protected by political cover, systemic corruption, and a fraudulent funding stream worth billions. Investigators found a final encrypted file on Hassan's server titled Phase 3 National Expansion. The plan outlined how the network intended to replicate the Minnesota model in 22 additional states, targeting refugee resettlement communities, embedding operatives in state human services agencies, and establishing cartel distribution networks in the Midwest, the Rust Belt, and the Mountain West. The goal was clear: turn the American social safety net into a permanent renewable funding source for the Sinaloa cartel's drug empire, protected by complicit politicians and shielded by the bureaucracy of government itself. This was not infiltration. This was colonization. One federal prosecutor, a woman named Jessica Brennan, who had spent 19 years prosecuting organized crime, stood before the evidence wall and spoke the truth that no one wanted to hear. They didn't just exploit the system, they redesigned it to serve the cartel for generations. On the morning of November 12, at 7:08 a.m., Minnesota State Senator Tahir Yusuf Hassan was arrested at his home in the Linden Hills neighborhood of Minneapolis. He did not resist. He did not speak. He was led out in handcuffs while news cameras captured every moment, the footage replaying across every major network by noon. Inside his home, agents found encrypted communication devices, coded financial ledgers, burner phones, and $1.9 million in cash hidden in vacuum-sealed bags inside a custom-built safe beneath his office floor. On his laptop, they found direct communications with Sinaloa cartel operatives, financial reports tracking drug shipments, and photographs of cartel meetings in Culiacan. Hassan was charged with conspiracy to commit wire fraud, money laundering, racketeering, conspiracy to distribute narcotics, corruption of public office, conspiracy to aid and abet a foreign drug cartel, and conspiracy to violate federal immigration and human trafficking laws. He faces life in prison without the possibility of parole. 94 other individuals, including nonprofit directors, state employees, billing specialists, logistics coordinators, and law enforcement officers, were arrested and charged in the days and weeks that followed. Federal prosecutors announced that they would seek forfeiture of over $400 million in assets, properties, and funds tied to Hassan's network. But this story is not just about one man, one cartel, or one state. It is about what happens when power, silence, and ambition are allowed to operate unchecked inside the systems that are meant to serve the public. It is about how corruption does not always announce itself with violence or chaos. Sometimes it announces itself with legislation, with budget approvals, with the quiet efficiency of a well-organized fraud. And it is about the cost. $19 billion stolen. Communities poisoned by fentanyl, methamphetamine, cocaine, and heroin. Families destroyed by addiction. Neighborhoods turned into drug distribution zones. Trust in government shattered. How many more networks like this exist? How many more officials have traded their oaths for cartel cash? This is a warning. A reminder that the systems we trust are only as strong as the people who operate them. And that organized crime does not always hide in the shadows. Sometimes it sits in a legislative chamber, signs bills into law, and smiles for the cameras. If you are still watching this, tap like so more people see this story. Comment expose if you want corruption like this dragged into the light where it belongs. Share this so the silence stops being an option, because power does not need violence when it has silence and ambition. And the only way to stop it is to refuse to stay quiet. This story is fictional, but the warning it carries is real.